So today we have Kristin Oxley, firstly, who is both a special advisor at the Research Council of Norway and a PhD candidate at the University of Oslo. At the Research Council of Norway, Kristin works on strategy development and research and innovation policy, with a special focus on peer review and interdisciplinary research. For the last 10 years, she's regularly acted as an observer of the evaluation processes deployed within the EU framework programmes on research and innovation, advising the Commission and the further development of peer review procedures. Her PhD research focuses on the added value of panel review compared to aggregation of individual reviews, the inherent challenges faced by assessment panels in evaluating interdisciplinary novel research ideas, and the challenges associated and evaluating impact ex ante in grant peer review panels and the effect that organisational context has upon those panels. Today, Kristin will speak about the tension between scientific creativity and scientific judgments.
Perfect. So, as they said, the subject of my talk is this tension between scientific creativity and scientific judgments. So, let's see if I can yes. So, I thought I would first explore the concept of creativity in science with you, and then look into how exposure to judgment affects creativity. And without giving too much away, there's quite extensive evidence that scientific judgments are indeed quite conservative. So I'll finish off by looking into 4 options for research funders to tilt scientific judgments in favor of creativity. But if you first look at scientific creativity and creativity more generally, it's commonly defined as the production of ideas that are both novel in the sense of being original and new, but also being useful in the sense of being relevant and feasible. Because you can argue that ideas that are original but not feasible are largely irrelevant, whereas ideas that are feasible but not original are more mainstream. And naturally, all research can be considered to be creative to some extent, but to varying degrees. And in this respect, advancements in research is commonly perceived to occur along this kind of continuum between these two main categories of advancement. So on the one hand, advancements can happen incrementally. So new projects, they build on the results of previous studies, they test earlier hypotheses, theories. And then in that kind of research, scientific progress is kind of evolutionary. So prevailing paradigms, they're expanded, they're changed over time. But then in significantly fewer cases, you have more dramatic research advances. So through the use of radically new approaches, methods, interpretations, our understanding of a scientific phenomenon changes quite dramatically, or we see the emergence of new research fields or new paradigms. And it is argued that these two kind of main categories or approaches, they're not contradictory, they complement each other, and that a well-functioning research system, they must kind of cater to both. And I think this complementarity is very well illustrated by this quote here. Basically that a discovery becomes transformative by the volume of productive research that follows, so that it's the deflection of the stream of research along a new course, which is the transformation. But there are examples from a variety of domains which suggest that the failure to recognize or select creative ideas is often a bigger problem than actually generating or producing them in the first place. And in the history of science, we have plenty of examples of path-breaking research achievements that were initially rejected by the scientific establishment, but because they challenged existing paradigms. And part of the reason for this is that in making judgments about scientific creativity, scientific peers, they use criteria such as plausibility and or originality. And there are really well-recognized tensions between these two kind of criteria that we use when we judge scientific contributions. And I think this quote here illustrates this tension very well. So you have the criteria plausibility, which tend to enforce conformity, while the value attached to originality encourages dissent. So you kind of have to both have a framework or discipline that both encourage, a framework that meets a professional standard, which imposes a framework and then also encourages rebellion against it. And of course, these kind of like highly creative contributions, they're a very varied bunch, but there is quite a lot of evidence showing that there is a close link between creativity and interdisciplinarity. For example, there are indications that research breakthroughs, they tend to happen in organizations where researchers communicate across disciplinary and thematic dividing lines. Also, there is evidence that creative researchers tend to collaborate in more extensive networks, more often connect colleagues who don't usually collaborate, and also that research breakthroughs are more common among researchers who are not necessarily very highly specialized, but that work in a lot of different research disciplines, and who therefore kind of like internalize a lot of scientific diversity. Similarly, there is evidence that major research breakthroughs tend to occur in projects that borrow concepts or approaches from one field and then use them in another. And then there's quite a lot of bibliometric evidence showing a link between interdisciplinarity and novelty. So highly novel papers, they tend to make more and also more distant combinations of knowledge fields than moderately novel papers. And there's also evidence that articles which are based on atypical connections between different research fields, that they are significantly more cited. So there is basically a lot of contributions documenting that highly creative researchers, they tend to recombine and reconfigure knowledge in unprecedented ways. But if we then look at the effects of being exposed to scientific judgment on creativity, there have been a number of studies on this subject, and overall they point to negative effects. So there are some studies that have studied this question more indirectly, so looking into the institutional conditions which are conducive to creativity. And conclusions here, they suggest that stable research sponsorship is a key factor in cultivating creativity, indicating then that competition might have the opposite effect. Others which have studied the question more directly also find negative effects. This quote here is from an interview-based study of German and Australian scientists, and they found that increased competitive funding hindered risky and non-mainstream research because applicants, they perceived that novel and untested ideas couldn't be included in a grant proposal. And their perceptions in that respect, they were often experience-based. So they reported having previously failed by trying to apply for innovative or risky projects. So the study concludes with this, along with this quote here, basically that only a certain degree of autonomy from the community makes it possible for the individual researcher to develop unorthodox perspective and ideas. And the robustness of these findings are supported by a recent study of the European Research Council, which explores the question of creativity and scientific judgments using bibliometric indicators, so a more quantitative approach to this question. And the authors of this study, they similarly conclude that scientists, they anticipate that risky proposals will have a difficult time at review, and therefore they respond accordingly. And they find that European Research Council applicants who fail in the second stage of review, they have a significantly lower likelihood of producing novel papers after being rejected compared with the successful applicants. So they hypothesize that through this experience, applicants learn that risk is not rewarded, so therefore they will adjust their research portfolio away from risky research. And with respect to interdisciplinary judgments more specifically, there are indications that interdisciplinary proposals face a competitive disadvantage. Highly interdisciplinary proposals in particular may have a hard time in the review process. For example, there was a study, a very extensive one, more than 18,000 proposals were studied, which were submitted to the Australian Research Council. And the results show that the probability of receiving funding, they decreased as the degree of interdisciplinarity of the proposal increased. And there's also been a study in the UK context, in the UK Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, which found that team members with interdisciplinary backgrounds were disadvantaged in the competition for funding. So given these findings with respect to bias of sort against creativity and scientific judgment, it's perhaps not surprising that in parallel with an increase in competitive pressure, we have seen a decrease in scientific creativity. There was a recent study which has analyzed massive amounts of data on 45 million papers, 3.9 million patents across 6 decades, which found that papers and patents are increasingly less likely to break with the past, and also that this pattern holds universally across research fields. So that's kind of like a bleak picture of the current state of affairs. So the question is what research councils like my own and Alex can do in order to counter this kind of conservatism in scientific judgment. So here I thought I would look into 4 different options. So adjusting program design, adjusting peer review design, avoiding peer review, and reducing competition more generally. Excuse me. So if we first look into the option of adjusting program design, one response to the increased attention paid to decreased creativity has been the setting up of programs which specifically target highly novel, highly risky original research. And that's based on the notion that current program structures are problematic. So funds tend to be granted for relatively limited time periods and with an obligation to provide very extensive specification concerning the expected research trajectory, the expected research outcomes. And highly novel research with its kind of like inherently more uncertain nature, it's believed that it lends itself badly to this kind of standard model. I mentioned the European Research Council earlier, and this is one of the best known attempts at addressing the deficiencies of current program structures with respect then to encourage creative research. And European Research Council funding, it deviates from the standard pattern by providing large, flexible budgets, long time horizons, and also importantly, an explicit invitation to submit highly original and unconventional projects. And this picture that you see here is from a study by Lodell and Glaser. It's an interview study where they show that these funding properties, they link up with creative research. So as you see in this figure, you have the competition properties associated with the European Research Council on the right. So high amount of funding, flexible budget, long duration of funding, etc. And these properties then link up with the necessary conditions for highly creative research here in the middle. And then these in turn link with the properties associated with highly creative research here on the left. So they're kind of like able to show the connections between the funding characteristics and the research characteristics associated with highly creative research. But an issue with the ERC model is that it kind of retains this need for applicants to package their research into projects which specify the expected research trajectory and also expected research outcomes. But in terms of the studies on creative research, there are indications that programs which focus more on the individuals who apply rather than on the projects themselves, these are more successful in terms of encouraging creative research. exactly because these more groundbreaking ideas, they are difficult to formulate in the form of a project description with clear milestones, etc., that will convince the peer reviewers. So one of the best known examples of this approach is this here, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which is a nonprofit medical research organization in the US. And they offer grants as, by their own saying, which funds people, not projects. And they also follow up these grants in a very flexible manner. And importantly, funding is not discontinued if the investigators' early approaches don't work. So they have kind of like a lot of patience with risk in the early stages. And there's been a very influential study which has compared this kind of funding offered by Howard Hughes to similar scientists who were awarded funding from the National Institutes of Health in the US. And the National Institute of Health, they are more traditional. They give more traditional grants. So they fund projects and they're not particularly tolerant of early failure. And the analysis, this comparative analysis, revealed that the Howard Hughes grantees, they produced higher impact and also more novel research than the National Institutes of Health grantees. And also importantly, that grantees, they engaged in more risky research after they received this funding. So they had a lot more flops in terms of citations, but also then more hits compared to their citation profile prior to receiving this grant. And if you then contrast that with the ERC, there's been a recent analysis carried out, which shows considerably less positive results than this analysis of the Howard Hughes grants. So basically, this ERC study finds that applicants which have a history carrying out highly novel research, they are less likely to be selected for funding at the ERC compared with the applicants that don't have such a history, and also that this bias against novelty, it applies to those applicants that have a history of high gain publications. So it's not a question of quality, it's more a question of the kind of research carried out. And the authors also test whether receiving a long and generous ERC grant promotes risk-taking, but they find no evidence that recipients are more likely to engage in risky research after they receive this grant. So quite contrary then to the Howard Hughes results. So those are some of the options in terms of adjusting program design. But an alternative to launching dedicated funding programs for this kind of creative research is to adopt more of a mainstreaming approach, so adjusting the general peer review process in order to adjust or reduce conservatism in the process. And one measure that has been investigated in this respect is to use reviewers with highly diverse expertise. And there are indications that this could serve to counteract the bias against interdisciplinarity specifically, but also against creativity more generally. There was a study of panels, admittedly in a business setting, which found that using more diverse reviewers induced panels to select more unconventional ideas. And also in my own research on how panels assess interdisciplinarity, I find that the use of highly diverse panels can serve to counteract this common tendency for panels to prefer proposals that are largely aligned with their own expertise profile. And another option for adjusting peer review process to a less conservative mode is to give dedicated criteria for creativity. There's been quite a lot of research in social psychology on this subject, and they find that giving explicit selection criteria and panel instructions which emphasize novelty and creativity, that improves panels' ability to select these kind of ideas. And in my own research on interdisciplinarity, I also find that the use of dedicated criteria is important to counter these panels' tendency to disfavor highly interdisciplinary proposal. But in order to ensure that these kind of criteria actually have an impact on the final scores, it appears it's necessary that these criteria that they are scored separately, so that they're not included as a sub-criterion within the more composite review criteria, and also that panels have very clear guidelines on the relative weight that should be assigned to the individual criteria when they determine the overall score. So basically, overall score should be calculated rather than set discretionally by the panels. Another option for adjusting peer review process to a less conservative mode is to introduce a lottery element. And the idea here is to first rely on peer reviewers to separate applications that are worthy of funding from those that are not. And then you select the grant winners among these worthy applicants based on a lottery. And those who favor this kind of approach, they argue that a lottery can reduce some of the bias, which is associated with highly creative proposals, because it would then be possible for proposals where reviewers disagree to actually make it into this fundable lottery pool. And it's assumed that here then that there will be a tendency for reviewers to disagree more about these highly novel grant proposals, compare them to more incremental work. And this kind of lottery approach is becoming increasingly common. So there's many funders who have experimented with it and included it in their more standard operating procedures, including in the UK, and also in Norway in my own research council. So that's some of the options that research councils have for adjusting peer review. More radical options would be to opt for alternatives that largely kind of eliminates peer review. And one of the best known example in this respect is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, better known as DARPA, who use single person selection. So basically the program, they hire highly qualified entrepreneurial program officers for 4 to 6 years to assume responsibility for managing and granting research funding in their field of expertise. And this is a non-renewable short-term service, which is therefore designed then to encourage risk-taking and foster innovation in project funding. So the program officers, they use external peer review often for advisory purposes, but they have full autonomy to make the final funding decisions. And following the success of this kind of model, there's many who have tried to emulate it. So the US itself has set up ARPAs in energy, intelligence, health, many sectors. And also, as some of you are probably familiar with, recently the UK has also set up its own version of it, so ARIA. Whereas at EU level, there are also now initiatives ongoing to kind of like try to emulate this kind of DARPA approach to research funding. So it's very in vogue. So that then leads us to the last option for tilting the balance in favor of creativity that I thought I would explore with you, that of reducing competition. So as we've seen, competition in general appears to have a negative effect on the scope for carrying out highly creative research. And as competitive pressure grows, scope for supporting highly novel research appear to be further reduced. So success rates in funding programs, so this you see here, these are success rates in funding programs in the UK, in the NIH, in the United States, and the Australian Research Council. And as you see, these have decreased quite substantially over time. And the quote here is from an observational study of my research council here in Norway, which has traditionally had very low success rates for its bottom-up scheme, dedicated to excellent research. But recently, this has changed in response to political pressure to increase our success rates without receiving any additional funds. The Research Council of Norway has moved from a yearly deadline for applications to removing all deadlines for this bottom-up funding program. Also, we introduced quarantine measures for very low-scoring proposals, and this has resulted in a lot fewer applications and more than a tripling of success rates. So it's gone from around 5% to 20%. So that kind of testifies that Research Council do have some leeway for manipulating competitive pressures, even without the possibility of increasing funding. But to sum up then, competitive pressure, it seems to have a negative impact on the scope for carrying out very highly creative research. Research councils, they have some scope for tilting the balance of the competition more or less in favor of creativity by adjusting the scope, the rules, and the procedures of funding arrangements. But the balance overall between creativity concerns and other worthwhile goals of R&D funding is largely determined by political funding priorities. And there are a lot of references for those who are interested.